Welcome to Silent Screams. Tonight, we unravel 3 chilling tales of survival that will leave you gripping the edge of your seat. These are true pit-stop horror stories, where ordinary travelers encountered the extraordinary and faced the unimaginable. Let's begin. The first story comes from a man named Lucas. He was a seasoned truck driver, used to long hours on the road, endless stretches of asphalt, and desolate highways under starless skies. That night, he was driving through a remote region he'd traveled countless times before. It was just past 1 a.m., and he hadn't seen another car in over an hour. His rig rumbled along the quiet highway, headlights cutting through the thick darkness ahead. The road seemed to stretch into nothingness, disappearing into the void. He pulled into a small gas station, one of those rare, isolated ones where the neon sign flickered weakly, buzzing like an insect caught in a light fixture. The place seemed abandoned, the windows were covered in dust, and the pumps looked ancient. Lucas shrugged it off. Truckers learned not to be picky, especially this far from civilization. He stepped out of his truck, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. As he began filling his tank, he noticed something, a van parked in the shadows behind the station. Its windows were pitch black, reflecting none of the dim light from the station's lone bulb. Lucas couldn't see inside, but he could feel eyes on him. His skin prickled, and a chill ran down his spine. He told himself it was nothing. Probably another traveler taking a break, maybe sleeping inside. But as he finished pumping gas and glanced over his shoulder, the van's engine roared to life. Lucas froze. The van's headlights flicked on, blinding him for a moment. It pulled forward slowly, creeping toward his truck like a predator sizing up its prey. He climbed back into his cab, locking the doors. His heart pounded as the van stopped directly in front of his truck, blocking his way. It sat there, engine idling, the glow of its lights casting strange, dancing shadows against the station wall. Suddenly, the van's passenger door opened, but no one stepped out. The door swung on its hinges, creaking loudly in the still night. Lucas stared, his breath caught in his throat, waiting for someone, or something, to emerge. But no one did. After what felt like an eternity, the door slammed shut on its own. The van reversed abruptly and sped off into the night, tires screeching. Lucas didn't wait to find out more. He gunned his truck's engine and tore back onto the highway, his heart racing. The image of that van burned into his mind. But the van wasn't done with him. Minutes later, its headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, growing closer and closer. Lucas pushed the accelerator to its limit, his massive truck barreling down the road at a dangerous speed. The van matched him, its engine roaring behind him. The chase continued for miles until Lucas saw the faint glow of a rest stop ahead. He swerved into the lot, tires screeching as he parked under the brightest light he could find. The van didn't follow. Instead, it lingered on the road for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. Lucas spent the rest of the night at that rest stop, parked among a few other trucks. He never saw the van again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, had been inside was still watching him. The second story is one that haunts a family to this day. Lisa, her husband Mark, and their 2 children were driving cross-country for a much-needed vacation. They had been on the road for hours and decided to stop at a diner they'd spotted on the side of the highway. It was an old, rickety place, the kind you only see in movies, with peeling paint and a rusting sign that barely clung to its frame. Inside, the air was stale, and the faint smell of burnt coffee lingered. The diner was almost empty. A single waitress stood behind the counter, her back to them, cleaning glasses with slow, deliberate movements. In the far corner, a group of 3 men sat in silence, their faces obscured by shadows. They weren't eating or drinking, just sitting there, watching. Lisa felt a pang of unease but brushed it off. They were probably locals, she thought. Small-town people always seemed a little odd to outsiders. The waitress finally turned around, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes dark and sunken. She handed them menus without a word. Mark tried to make small talk, but she only nodded absently, her gaze flickering toward the men in the corner. Lisa noticed it too, how the waitress seemed nervous, almost afraid. As they ordered their meals, the men in the corner began whispering to one another, their voices low and gravelly. It was impossible to make out what they were saying, but their eyes never left the family. When the food arrived, it was cold and unappetizing, but they ate in silence, not wanting to draw attention. The oppressive atmosphere made every bite feel like a chore. Suddenly, one of the men stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked to the jukebox in a corner, dropped a coin in, and selected a song. The machine groaned to life, playing an old, scratchy tune that sounded more like a funeral dirge than a diner classic. Lisa whispered to Mark that they should leave, but he hesitated. They hadn't paid yet, and he didn't want to cause a scene. As he got up to approach the counter, one of the other men stood up, blocking his path. He smiled, a cold, toothy grin that made Mark's blood run cold. "Leaving so soon?" the man asked, his voice a low rumble. Before Mark could respond, the lights in the diner flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the men were gone. Their chairs sat empty, the jukebox silent. The waitress was gone too, the counter abandoned. Mark rushed back to the table, his heart pounding. "We're leaving now," he said, grabbing the kids and ushering them to the car. As they drove away, Lisa glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The men were standing in the diner's doorway, watching them leave, their faces blank and expressionless. She didn't say a word, but the image stayed with her long after the diner disappeared in the distance. The final story comes from a solo traveler named Mia, who decided to drive through the night to reach her destination faster. She pulled into a rest area around 2 a.m., planning to take a quick nap before continuing. The place was eerily quiet, with only a few other cars parked sporadically. Most of the occupants seemed to be sleeping. Mia reclined her seat, wrapping herself in a blanket. She had just started to drift off when she heard a soft tapping on her window. She sat up, startled, but there was no one there. She brushed it off as a branch or maybe a bird. But the tapping came again, louder this time. She peered out into the darkness and saw nothing. That's when she noticed the trees. Carved into their trunks were strange symbols, intricate and unnatural, glowing faintly under the moonlight. Her breath hitched as she realized they hadn't been there when she arrived. A figure moved in the corner of her vision, darting between the trees. It was too fast to make out any details, but she knew she wasn't alone. She locked her doors, gripping her phone tightly, ready to call for help. Suddenly, her car shook violently, as if something heavy had landed on the roof. She screamed, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the keys. The roof dented inward, and a low, guttural growl echoed in her ears. She started the engine and floored it, speeding out of the rest area without looking back. Her rearview mirror showed nothing but empty road, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. As dawn broke, she finally pulled into a busy truck stop, the safety of other people calming her nerves. But when she stepped out of the car, her blood ran cold. Carved into the roof of her vehicle were the same glowing symbols she had seen on the trees.